How's everyone? Everyone's good? First, I'd like to introduce who's on the seated with me here on the stage. First, to my, you all know Chief Cheryl Scott, the far end, right? Deputy Chief of Crimes Against Persons, in charge of all of these investigations that we are going to talk about today. And then next to her is Lieutenant Wilson, Richard Wilson. He's the lieutenant over the Sexual Assaults Unit, the unit that investigated these cases. Next to him is Detective Perez. She is one of the investigators that assisted the lead investigator who is in Baton Rouge on these cases. And to my right is Detective Kramer, who also assisted the lead investigator who's in Baton Rouge on these cases. And then you have Lieutenant Hart. He is in charge of our Metro Unit Task Force, and they played a significant role. People that worked under him played a significant role in capturing this suspect Dixon. Chief Coleman is the deputy chief on the far end. He's the deputy chief of the Southeast Patrol Division. That's the division that has a geography where these crimes occurred. And he played a significant role as well in all of these investigations. What I'd like to do is first go through the chronology of the investigation. And it's going to be a lot of detail. I'll try to talk as slow as I can so you can grab all this. It's confusing and very complex. And after that, I'll have just very short commentary before I open it up for questions. When I open it up for questions, just to be as orderly as we can to make sure you can get all your questions in, and what I like to do is go around, I have your names and who you're affiliated with, and give you a question and a follow-up, and then go to the next person. So question and follow-up, question, follow-up. And then once I make sure I touched everybody with a question and a follow-up opportunity, I'll come back around if we have more for a second round of the same thing. And what I'll try to do is get you, every one of you, an opportunity to ask any and every question you absolutely have based on this. And you should have gotten a copy of what I'm going to say. I hope that helps you prepare between now and 10 o'clock. So there's no surprises or anything that I'm going to pull a rabbit out of a hat or anything. Okay? So let me start with the first investigation, first victim. And the page I'm starting from, it says South Dallas sexual assaults. So June 22nd, our victim survivor number 1 was sexually assaulted at 4600 Metropolitan, 4:45 a.m. in the morning. The victim was given a ride in a car by a male she'd met who stated he believed he would be offered sex for pay from the victim. Prior to any discussion of this type, the male told the victim he needed to urinate, and she directed him to a nearby building. After exiting the vehicle, the male was approached by the suspect Dixon, we believe. We don't know that yet, but we believe that's who the suspect was, who produced a gun and demanded money. The male was able to escape the suspect and flee the scene. After robbing the male, the suspect forced the victim, our victim survivor, into the vehicle and drove off with the victim inside. Suspect then committed the sexual assault. Suspect then set the vehicle on fire, burning it, and then fled the scene. Both the male and the female victim survivor contacted the police department to report the incident. The female victim survivor of the sexual assault declined medical treatment and did not want to submit to an exam to gather evidence of the assault. The female victim provided the reporting officer with erroneous contact information, which prevented sexual assault detectives from conducting any further investigation. After September 3rd, when it was determined that this victim was our first victim in this series of sexual assaults, the Southeast Deployment Division officers conducted an extensive search to locate her for the follow-up investigation. She was located by these officers at Southeast Division, and then she scheduled an interview with detectives on September 6th, but she didn't show up for that one. And she has not responded to repeated attempts to schedule an appointment to this day. On June 30th, we had our second sexual assault. The victim survivor and a female friend were leaving a nightclub at 2 o'clock in the morning when they got separated, and the suspect approached the victim and committed the sexual assault. The victim survivor received medical treatment at Parkland Hospital, and the evidence of the sexual assault was collected. The victim survivor in this case was first interviewed by sexual assault detectives on July 8th, and again on September 6th, after it was determined that a series of related attacks had occurred. DNA evidence from this offense has linked suspect Dixon to this crime. It should be noted at this point that when detectives conduct follow-up interviews, they work to guarantee that sufficient information is obtained to ensure the victim survivor of sexual assault is able to receive justice, and serve with the apprehension and successful prosecution of their attacker. These interviews are typically scheduled at a date and time most comfortable to these victim survivors to ensure at least the least amount of time of trauma for the victim. Forcing a victim survivor to participate in an investigation interview too soon could result in unnecessary trauma as well as incomplete or inaccurate information being gathered to assist the investigation. From June 30th through August 20th, there were no further reported assaults from which to base any type of suspicion on any type of serial offender at this point. But on August 20th, victim survivor number 4 and 5 were sexually assaulted at 4300 Spring Avenue at 2:30 a.m. They were approached by the suspect. They were walking down the street together. Both the victim survivors were treated at Parkland Hospital, and evidence kits were collected. One of these survivors were interviewed on August 23rd. However, the other victim survivor could not be contacted based on the original contact information not being correct. Detectives were eventually able to obtain good information, and a victim scheduled an interview on September 3rd, and this was the earliest that she was available. DNA collected from these sexual assaults was positively linked to suspect Dixon on September 9th. On August 22nd, we had this victim survivor number 6. It was the 5th offense in sequence of when it was reported, but it was number 6 in offense when it occurred. She was at a bus stop when the suspect approached her, presented a gun, directed her to walk behind a building. He then robbed her and then sexually assaulted her. She was treated at Parkland Hospital, and an evidence kit was collected. On August 23rd, detectives attempted to contact her multiple times by phone, postcard, or email with no success. A friend of the victim survivor has been asked to pass a message to her. It is believed she has moved to another city and has not been interviewed as of this time. Results from the evidence kit that she gave has yet to be given to us at this point. On August 27th through August 30th, the Southeast Patrol Division and the Metro Unit Task Force began to respond to these sexual assaults in the area. This information had not been previously released by the department. Uniformed and covert officers patrols were assigned to the area on the 30th. These patrols focused on the area where the assaults had been reported and conducted during these times and the offense had occurred. So they were there from 2 a.m. to 4 in the morning trying to capture the suspect. At the time the additional patrols were initiated, detectives had only been able to interview 2 of the 5 reported victims from offense number 2 and offense number 4. This made it extremely difficult for the detectives to definitely announce a serial offender who was responsible for all the offenses reported in the area. The first 2 offenses had occurred 8 days apart, and then no other offenses were reported in the area for, it has 50 days here in your notes, but it was about 51 days, which further complicated trying to link up these offenses. On August 30th, victim survivor number 8 was assaulted at 5:45 a.m. at 3200 Meadow Street. The victim and her 2 children were walking to a DART station when they were confronted by the suspect and robbed at gunpoint. The suspect told the children to leave and took the victim survivor to another location where he sexually assaulted her. This victim survivor was treated at Parkland, and an evidence kit was collected that resulted in a positive match to the suspect on September 7th, which was the first match linking suspect Dixon to these crimes. The victim survivor had to cancel 2 interviews, but was able to meet with detectives on September 9th. On September 1st, victim survivor number 9 was assaulted at 3800 Spring at 4:15 a.m. in the morning. The victim survivor was walking from work when approached by the suspect. She was robbed and then sexually assaulted. This survivor was treated at Parkland, and an evidence kit was collected. Results from this kit are not yet available from the lab. On September 3rd, if you recall, the Crimes Against Persons Sexual Assault Unit completes its assessment of reported sexual assaults in South Dallas and believes sufficient cause exists to announce the presence of a serial offender in the area to the public at large. Press conferences scheduled and the announcement is made. In determining the proper timing for such an announcement, multiple factors must be reviewed. These include whether or not victims have been interviewed, and do the interviews bear out the existence of a serial offender, the need to capture the offender without alerting him, the necessity of the community being alerted for public safety reasons, the likelihood of additional trauma for victims due to the public pronouncement, whether or not the announcement would deter or encourage other victims to come forward, ensuring criminal cases would not be jeopardized by the announcement. And the police department, recognizing the timing of such announcement is critical, and has reached out to the community and victim advocates for feedback to continue to make these decisions in a timely and informed manner. At that point, after the announcement, a task force consisting of Sexual Assault Unit, Southeast Patrol, Fusion Center, which is our intelligence gathering center, our Sex Offender Registration Unit, our Physical Evidence Unit, of course the Metro Task Force, as I mentioned, the Robbery Unit, because robberies had been involved in each and every one of them, and the Property Crime Unit was a part of this entire task force, and they began to meet daily. On September 4th, a Crime Stoppers tip is received at 8 in the morning that leads the department to Van Dixon as a person of interest. The Metro Unit locates Dixon around 7 p.m. and he consents to an interview by the sexual assault detective at police headquarters. The interview lasts slightly more than 2 hours. Dixon provides a DNA sample via buccal swab and is transported home. He voluntarily consents to a search of his residence for his car and for weapons. At that time, he remained a person of interest. Then on that same day, victim survivor number 7 hears about the announcement on September 3rd through the press conference, And she reports that on August 28th at 11:30 p.m., she was sexually assaulted at 2600 2nd Avenue. She says she was accosted at gunpoint and dragged to a vacant lot where the offense occurred. No medical treatment or evidence kit was performed due to delay in reporting the offense. Too much time had passed. She was interviewed on September 5th. Members of the task force continue to meet, following up on numerous Crime Stopper tips, reviewing sex offender registration records, following investigative protocols, and conducting uniform and covert patrols in the South Dallas area. On September 5th, victim survivor number 3, in order, but the 9th offense in sequence, is approached by a neighborhood patrol officer from the Southeast Division who was handing out flyers in the neighborhood. And she stated that she had been assaulted between July 24th through July 31st at 2700 Morning Avenue, between the hours of 4:15 a.m. and 5 o'clock a.m. Obviously, no evidence kit could be collected due to the time that had passed, and detectives interviewed the victim survivor on September 5th. On that same day, September 5th, around 12:16 in the afternoon, the department receives information that leads them to identifying Alan Mason as a person of interest. This information comes from an anonymous tipster who said the individual needed to get out of town, meaning Mason, because he had done something wrong. Tipster said he drove a vehicle similar to the one described by victim survivors, wore the same type of glasses, the gold-rimmed prescription glasses, and that he drinks all day and night. Efforts began at that point to locate Mason, who had an outstanding warrant for a DWI probation violation. After about 11 hours of attempting to locate Mason as a person of interest without success, I made the decision to announce to the public and put out a picture of Mason to solicit the public's help in finding him. I then, at 11:45, tweet that Mason is a person of interest. Difficulties with the police department's communication provider delayed our public information office from putting out that announcement until 12:04 in the morning. On September 6th, we locate Mason in Arlington. He is interviewed by detectives prior to being placed in jail on an outstanding warrant. Mason provides the department a DNA sample via buccal swab. He still is currently in the Dallas County Jail on unrelated charges of probation violation on a DWI. Around 7:30 p.m., this is information that we hadn't previously released. On that same day, Van Dixon's employer comes to the Northeast Patrol Division station to report that Dixon had not been at work for 2 days, which was uncharacteristic of him. The employer stated that he had called Dixon's aunt, and she told him, the employer, that Dixon had come to her home late Wednesday, the 4th, left his children with her, and stated that she would not see him again for a long time. The officer then notified the sexual assault unit detectives, who passed the information on to Metro Unit officers, and Metro Unit officers immediately began, without success, to try to locate him, but they were unable to. On September 7th, the next day, at about 9 a.m. in the morning, the department is notified of a positive DNA match linking Van Dixon to the offense that occurred on June 30th. Elements of the task force began to search for Dixon at that point. Warrants for his arrest are issued. Search warrants are issued for his home and prepared and signed by 3 p.m. Dixon's vehicle information is entered in a national database to determine that his car had been towed from the parking lot of a Garland McDonald's because it was abandoned there. Surveillance footage from the McDonald's camera shows Dixon parking the car at 7:59 a.m. on September 5th. The search warrant is executed at Dixon's home in the afternoon. Task force unit officers began canvassing family members of Dixon's, his friends of Dixon's, associates of Dixon's, to determine his location. Shortly after 5 p.m., after all those efforts were unsuccessful, we put out Dixon's pictures to the public and officially announced him as a suspect in one of these sexual assaults. On September 8th, this is also information that we had not previously released. On September 8th, ICE, Homeland Security, notifies the police department that Dixon may have crossed the border and entered Mexico near Laredo. They were going from footage from video that's at the border crossings. The picture, in their opinion, resembled Dixon. They then later reported, ICE later reported, that Dixon may have re-entered the country. On September 9th, members of the local U.S. Marshals North Texas Task Force developed information suggesting that Dixon may be in central Louisiana area. They then contacted the U.S. Marshals Middle Louisiana Fugitive Task Force to request their assistance in apprehending suspect Dixon. That same day, September 9th, additional DNA results are provided to the department, positively linking Dixon to 3 more of the reported sexual assaults. On September 10th, Van Dixon is located in a motel in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and placed under arrest by the U.S. Marshals and Middle Louisiana Task Force. This is additional information coming up next that's new. Dixon is interviewed and makes a statement that links him to one of the 2 remaining sexual assaults where an evidence kit was obtained, but processing for DNA evidence was not concluded yet. This leaves only one remaining case where an evidence kit, where DNA was obtained, that is still being processed for DNA. Once that's completed, once that one additional outstanding evidence kit is completed, Mason can be positively excluded as a person of interest. In the South Dallas area, where the 9 sexual assaults have occurred, there are 12 crime watch groups. 5 of these crime watch groups, 5 of the 12, conducted meetings in all 3 months of this crime spree. And 1 group held meetings in June and July. The other 6 groups, crime watch groups in the area of the 12, were inactive during this time period. Southeast Patrol Division neighborhood police officers attended each of the meetings that were held in the area where the rapes occurred. At all of the Crime Watch meetings, officers are expected to provide crime statistics to citizens to make them aware of the criminal offenses occurring in their neighborhood. We believe this did take place, that the crime statistics, the reading of the crime stats did take place at each of these meetings, and we are working and have been working to confirm our belief. Crime stats would typically focus on specific areas served by the Crime Watch and might not provide a picture of the larger area. And so if you think about Crime Watch, basically as a neighborhood watch, there are 12 that cover this entire area. This investigation happened in 3 phases. The initial crime is the first phase. The investigation, when the Sexual Assaults Unit took over, and the identification and capture when mostly Metro, Task Force, U.S. Marshals all took over. In each of these phases, each of these 3 phases presented key decision points that all presented ethical dilemmas. The first, when to alert the public at large of the rapes. Immediately, alerting the public immediately allows the public to be more cautious, possibly preventing more assaults, possibly bringing more victims forward, and would possibly bring in more leads. In contrast, immediately notifying the public would probably dissuade victims from coming forward. That did occur. Would likely alert the suspect. That did occur. Would likely lead to a number of false tips. That did occur. Would likely cause the suspect to change the area and modus operandi of his crimes. Would likely make it more difficult, if not impossible, to charge, apprehend, and prosecute the suspect. The next decision point, whether to alert the public of a person of interest from circumstantial evidence. If you recall the Richard Jewell case, it was a case study of the bombing at the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta and the subsequent lawsuit. That led law enforcement. He was called a suspect, if you don't recall that. Richard Jewell was called a suspect in the bombings and then ultimately cleared and then sued for defamation of character, libel, and was awarded a judgment from that, being called a suspect. So since 1996, law enforcement had used the terminology of person of interest instead of the term suspect when investigations are based on circumstantial evidence. Further mitigation of the term person of interest, we clearly stated that Mr. Mason is not a suspect. And we never referred to Mr. Mason as a suspect. In addition, we also exhausted all leads to find Mr. Mason before announcing him as a person of interest for over 11 hours before I tweeted and released his photo. Absolutely no one should refer to or think of Mr. Mason as a suspect. In contrast, if we were wrong and the tipster was right, we couldn't overcome the further time delay beyond 11 hours. The fact that Mr. Mason has warrants for his arrest for an unrelated probation violation is the reason and the only reason he is in jail. It's unfair to Mr. Mason that anyone has mistakenly perceived, assumed, or thought in any way that Mr. Mason was ever a suspect. As soon as we have confirmation from the one other analysis of DNA, then we will no longer refer to Mr. Mason as a person of interest. The last decision point: when to alert the public of a confirmed suspect. Once we received DNA confirmation of Dixon as a suspect, I gave officers 7 hours to capture him before alerting the public. I believed at that time that our best chance to capture him was before he knew we identified him as a suspect. I thought our second best chance to capture him was to alert the public with this picture, but that this choice had a small window of opportunity and would take some time. That ended up being true. Finally, throughout this investigation, I chose the decision path as chief that would give our officers the best chance to catch the suspect, charge the suspect, prosecute, and convict this suspect. Escape meant more victims in probably different areas in this city or elsewhere. My instincts told me that this suspect, once alerted, would run. That was true. This was unlikely to be an eyewitness identification case. If you recall, in all the rapes, he covered his face. Therefore, the suspect had to have sample matches either in the national DNA database called CODIS, or we had to retrieve samples of DNA from persons of interest. I'm going to repeat that. This was unlikely to be an eyewitness identification case. Therefore, the suspect had to have his sample DNA in the national database called CODIS, C-O-D-I-S, or we had to retrieve samples from persons of interest to be able to match to the DNA that we had from the victim survivors. In addition, expedited DNA analysis would take a minimum of 4 days. So once we got a sample from a person of interest, the absolute fastest it could happen is 4 days. I believed we could give the suspect no more than 8 hours lead time to run and still have a chance to capture him. This is my last statement before taking the questions. At the end of the day, in the final analysis, each of the 3 decision points throughout this entire ordeal had undesirable trade-offs and human error. But doing any and everything we could to capture this suspect was not an option. With that, we'll start with the questions. Let's start with Calvert Collins.